There is a stretch of road in Central America, 8 kilometers long, that sits between two countries and belongs to neither of them. It is not a particularly dramatic piece of road to look at. There are no cliffs falling away on one side, no bridges suspended over impossibly deep gorges, no tunnels cut through mountains that would justify the kind of legend that has grown up around this place. It is just a road, asphalt mostly, some gravel in places, lined with trees on both sides that lean over the surface and filter the light in the way that tropical vegetation always does, turning everything underneath it green and dim and slightly unreal. 8 kilometers of ordinary-looking road between the Guatemalan border post at El Florido on one side and the Honduran border post at Agua Caliente on the other. And trucks go in and do not come out. Subscribe right now if you want to understand the world the way it actually is, not the cleaned-up version you get in travel guides and news segments, but the real thing, the complicated thing, the version with blood and money and fear and geography and history all tangled together in ways that take your breath away. Let us go. The road itself has a name, or rather, it has a designation, because roads in this part of Central America are not always named in the way that cities name their famous streets. It is part of the CA-10, the Central American Highway Corridor that connects Guatemala to Honduras, through the department of Chiquimula on the Guatemalan side, and Copan on the Honduran side. The region around it is one of the most historically significant in the entire Western Hemisphere. The ancient Maya city of Copan, one of the great intellectual and artistic centers of classic Maya civilization, sits just a few kilometers from the Honduran border crossing. Tourists come through here to see the hieroglyphic stairway and the carved stele and the ball court of one of the most sophisticated cultures that the American continent ever produced. They drive this road in air-conditioned vans and stop at the border to show their passports and continue on their way without a second thought. The trucks do not have that luxury, and it is the trucks that we need to talk about. To understand what happens in those 8 kilometers, you need to understand what those trucks are carrying, and where they have been, and where they are trying to go. Because the Central American Isthmus, this narrow land bridge between the Pacific Ocean and the Caribbean Sea that connects North America to South America, is one of the most important transit zones for commercial goods in the entire world. Everything that moves overland between Mexico and the countries to the south passes through here. Consumer electronics and pharmaceuticals and construction materials and agricultural machinery, fresh produce and dry goods and industrial chemicals, fuel, and of course, other things. Things that are not listed on any manifest. Things that travel hidden inside legitimate cargo in loads that have been double-checked and triple-checked by people who are paid very well to make sure the hiding is good enough to survive any inspection that is likely to occur. The volume of traffic on this road is staggering. Hundreds of trucks per day move through the El Florido and Agua Caliente crossings, part of a larger flow of commercial traffic that is the physical expression of Central American economic integration, of trade agreements and supply chains, and the relentless movement of goods across borders that defines the modern economy. Most of those trucks make it through. They submit their paperwork, they wait in the lines that stretch back sometimes for hours, or even days at the more congested crossings. They pay the fees, the official ones and the unofficial ones, and they continue. The driver's job is to get from point A to point B and collect his payment, and rest and do it again. But some of them disappear. Not metaphorically, not in the sense of records being lost or paperwork going missing, which also happens, and which is its own form of institutional erasure. Physically, the truck and its cargo, and sometimes its driver, enter the 8-kilometer stretch between the two border posts and do not emerge at the other end. Or they emerge stripped, or they emerge minus their cargo, the truck continuing with an empty trailer and a driver who either does not speak about what happened or, in some cases, does not continue at all. The people who move goods through this corridor, the dispatchers and the freight brokers and the logistics coordinators who sit in offices in Guatemala City and San Pedro Sula and Tegucigalpa and track the movements of their fleets on GPS screens, have a specific vocabulary for what happens in this zone. They talk about it the way professionals always talk about things that terrify them, with a flatness and a practicality that is itself a form of adaptation to the impossible. A load went sideways. The cargo did not arrive. There was a problem at the crossing. These are the euphemisms for outcomes that range from bribery to armed robbery to murder. And the range between those outcomes is not as wide as it sounds, because in this particular 8 kilometers, the categories tend to blur. Let me explain the geography more carefully, because geography is always the beginning of understanding anything about how power actually works in the real world. The 8-kilometer strip between the Guatemalan and Honduran border checkpoints is, in the strict legal sense, no man's land. When a truck leaves the Guatemalan checkpoint at El Florido, it has been officially processed out of Guatemala. Its paperwork has been stamped. The Guatemalan state has, in theory, discharged its responsibility for what happens to that truck and its cargo. When the truck arrives at the Honduran checkpoint at Agua Caliente, it will enter the official purview of the Honduran state, which will process it in, check its documents, and either pass it through or flag it for inspection. In between those two moments, in those 8 kilometers of road, the truck exists in a space that is technically in transit, technically within the territorial boundaries of one or another country, depending on exactly where it is on the road, but practically speaking, outside the effective jurisdiction of any state authority that is going to do anything about anything that happens to it. This is the gap, and gaps, in human geography, do not stay empty. They fill, and what they fill with is determined by who is positioned to fill them and what resources and capacity those people have and what they are trying to achieve. In this particular gap, in this particular stretch of road, between two of the poorer countries in the Western Hemisphere, in a region that has been shaped by a century of violent history involving American intervention and military governments and civil wars and their aftermaths, and the rise of organized crime structures that grew in the specific soil that all of that violence produced. What filled the gap was not benign. The criminal organizations that operate in this zone are not monolithic. This is important to understand, because the tendency when talking about organized crime in Central America is to describe it as a unified entity, as if the gangs and cartels and local criminal networks are all the same thing, operating under the same logic. They are not. The landscape of criminal power in the Guatemala-Honduras border region is complex and layered and constantly shifting, with different organizations controlling different aspects of the economy of the corridor and sometimes cooperating and sometimes violently competing, and sometimes simultaneously doing both, working together on one category of business while fighting over another. There are, broadly speaking, several layers of criminal interest in this 8 kilometers. There are the transnational drug trafficking organizations, the groups that use this corridor as part of the larger supply chain, moving cocaine from South American production zones through Central America toward the consumer markets of Mexico and the United States. For these organizations, the trucks on this road are either assets to be exploited, meaning their cargo space can be used for concealing product, or obstacles to be managed, meaning that any truck carrying something that is not their product needs to be controlled or cleared out of the way or taxed for the privilege of using infrastructure that they consider theirs. Then there are the local extortion networks, which operate at a different scale and with a different logic, extracting payment from every truck that passes through, on pain of consequences that range from delay and harassment to outright theft to violence. Then there are the corrupt officials, and this category requires some careful thinking because it is not entirely separate from the other two. It overlaps with them, because the line between a corrupt official who takes a bribe to look the other way and a criminal actor who happens to hold an official position is not a clear line. It is a gradient, and in the border zone of this 8-kilometer stretch, a significant number of the people who inhabit the gradient are on the wrong side of it. Let us talk about the trucks themselves, because the trucks are not passive in this story. The trucks are the central actors, and the decisions that get made about them, before they even arrive at the border, determine a great deal of what happens to them in the no man's land. A commercial truck driver working the Guatemala-Honduras route is a specific kind of professional. He, and the overwhelming majority of drivers on this route are men, often comes from the region itself, from the departments of Chiquimula and Zacapa in Guatemala, or Copan and Santa Barbara in Honduras. He likely knows the road the way you know a road that you have driven 100 times or 1,000 times. He knows where the potholes are, and where the road narrows, and where the shade is heaviest, and where you can pull over if you need to check the rig. He knows the officials at the border checkpoints, at least by sight. He knows which crossings are faster on which days, and what kind of mood the inspectors tend to be in, at what times. This is the intimate, granular knowledge of someone whose livelihood depends on moving efficiently through a specific place. He also knows, with a certainty that requires no documentation and no statistics, what can happen in the 8 kilometers. He knows it the way you know, a thing that has happened to people you know personally, to friends and colleagues and men from your town who drove the same road and had the same experience. He knows what it looks like when a truck is pulled over by men who are not police but who have weapons that police would carry. He knows what the demand is, because the demand is usually money or cargo or both. And he knows what happens when the demand is not met, because that is not theoretical knowledge in this part of the world. That is historical knowledge. He carries it in his body the way you carry the memory of any event that has defined the parameters of your safety. The dispatcher who sends him out is also making calculations. What time does the truck leave? Because the hour of departure affects the hour of arrival at the border zone, which affects the conditions under which the crossing happens, and conditions matter enormously. A truck arriving at the Guatemalan checkpoint in the late afternoon, after the officials who might offer some modicum of accountability have gone home, and the crossing is running on a skeleton crew of people whose motivations are not primarily institutional, is in a different position than a truck arriving in the morning rush, when there are other drivers and other witnesses and other vehicles, all competing for processing space. A truck that is known to be carrying a particularly valuable cargo, because cargo manifests circulate in ways that freight companies understand very well, and that criminal networks understand equally well, is in a different position than a truck carrying something mundane and low value. The dispatchers and the freight companies that can afford to do so use GPS tracking. They watch the little icon on the screen move along the road. They have alerts set for when a truck stops unexpectedly or deviates from its route. They have protocols for what happens when the icon stops moving and the driver does not answer his phone. The protocols exist because the scenario has happened before, more than once, enough times that having a protocol for it is simply operational planning and not catastrophizing. For the smaller operators, the independent truckers, and the small family-run freight companies that make up a significant portion of the commercial traffic on this route, the GPS tracking may not exist or may not be monitored in real time by anyone who can act on what it shows. An independent trucker on this route is operating with a level of personal risk exposure that most people in wealthier countries cannot fully comprehend. He is the driver and the dispatcher and the insurance policy and the collections agent all at once. If his cargo disappears, the consequences fall on him. If he is robbed, the loss is his. If something worse happens, the paperwork that follows involves institutions that may or may not function in ways that produce any meaningful result. I want to be very precise about something here, because precision matters, and because the imprecise version of this story is both more sensational and less true. Not every truck that crosses this 8 kilometers is robbed. Not every driver faces violence. The majority of commercial traffic on this route makes it through without incident, at least without the kind of overt, dramatic incident that makes it into statistics or reports. The corridor functions as a commercial route. Goods move, trade happens, and yet the knowledge of what can happen, the knowledge of what has happened, the knowledge of what is happening right now to some percentage of the loads moving through on any given day, shapes the entire experience of this road for everyone who uses it. The threat does not have to materialize every time to be real. The threat is real because it has materialized, because it materializes regularly enough that everyone operating in this space has incorporated it into their operating model. This is what political scientists and security analysts call a protection economy. The criminal organizations that operate in the border zone are not simply stealing, they are imposing a tax. In exchange for the payment of this tax, in money, or in kind, or in access to cargo space, or in the simple act of not acting against you, the trucks pass through. The payment is extortion, but it functions, from the perspective of the criminal organization imposing it, as revenue generation, And like any revenue generation scheme, it depends on the continued operation of the underlying economic activity. Dead trucks do not pay taxes. Destroyed cargo cannot be extracted value from. The goal of the sophisticated criminal actor in a transit zone is not to eliminate the flow, but to insert himself into it as a toll collector, to become a structural feature of the economy rather than a disruption to it. This is the logic that makes the 8 kilometers function the way it does. It is not chaos. It is a different kind of order, an order imposed by force, maintained by the credible threat of violence, and structured around the extraction of value from the economic activity that has no choice but to pass through this particular geographic bottleneck. The trucks that disappear entirely, the ones whose cargo does not arrive at the other end and whose drivers do not make their scheduled calls, are not the norm. They are the extreme end of a spectrum of extraction that runs from petty harassment at the low end to complete seizure and whatever follows from that at the high end. The spectrum itself, the fact of its existence, is the story. Now, let us zoom out, because this 8-kilometer strip of road does not exist in isolation. It is part of a larger geography of gaps, a geography that extends across the entire Central American isthmus, and that has a history going back much further than the contemporary criminal organizations that currently exploit it. To understand why this particular gap exists and why it functions the way it does, you need to understand the political and economic history of Guatemala and Honduras over the last century, and that history is one of the most consequential and least understood histories in the Western Hemisphere. Both countries spent the middle decades of the 20th century under military governments that received significant support from the United States government, whose Cold War strategic calculus placed an extraordinary premium on the suppression of leftist movements in the Americas, regardless of the cost to democratic governance or civilian populations. In Guatemala, this produced one of the most catastrophic chapters in modern Latin American history, the CIA-backed coup of 1954 that overthrew the democratically elected government of Jacobo Arbenz, followed by decades of military rule, counterinsurgency campaigns against indigenous communities in the highlands, and a civil war that ran from 1960 to 1996 and killed somewhere between 200,000 and 250,000 people, the vast majority of them Mayan civilians killed by state security forces. In Honduras, the calculus was somewhat different, but equally destructive in its long-term effects, with the country serving as a platform for American support of the Contra fighters in Nicaragua during the 1980s, and developing, in that context, a relationship between state institutions and extrajudicial violence that left permanent marks on the institutional fabric of the country. The peace agreements that ended Guatemala's civil war in 1996 and the democratic transitions that occurred across the region during the 1990s were genuine achievements, but they did not undo the institutional damage of decades of military rule and politically directed violence. The security forces that had spent decades operating outside any meaningful legal constraint did not transform overnight into professional, accountable, rights-respecting institutions simply because a peace accord was signed. The habits and networks and economies of corruption that had grown up within those institutions during the war years did not dissolve. They adapted. They found new contexts, new resources, new partners. The void that formed in the aftermath of the peace agreements, the space between the formal end of one system of violence and the construction of a functional alternative, was filled in part by criminal organizations. Some of these organizations had roots in the military and police structures of the conflict period. Some were branches of Mexican and Colombian drug trafficking networks that moved into Central America as interdiction pressure and territorial competition pushed them toward new transit routes. Some were the youth gangs, the Mara Salvatrucha and the Barrio 18, and their many offshoots, that had their own complex origins, partly in the deportation of Central American immigrants from Los Angeles back to countries they barely knew during the 1990s and 2000s, bringing with them gang structures that took root in environments of poverty and institutional weakness and post-war social fragmentation. By the 2000s and into the 2010s, Honduras had become, by some measures, the most violent country in the world that was not technically in a state of war, with homicide rates that exceeded those of many active conflict zones. The specific measurement is contested, and the rates have fluctuated, but the underlying reality that the number represents, that Honduras was a place where violent death was an ordinary feature of the social landscape for significant portions of the population, particularly young men, particularly in certain cities and certain regions. That reality is not contested. The border zone between Guatemala and Honduras, the Department of Chiquimula on the Guatemalan side, and the Department of Copan on the Honduran side, is not the most violent area in either country by the metrics that measure urban gang violence. It is not Tegucigalpa or San Pedro Sula or the dangerous neighborhoods of Guatemala City, where the headline violence concentrates. It is a rural border zone with its own specific dynamic, shaped by the transit economy and the territorial claims of trafficking organizations and the particular vulnerabilities of the people who move through it. The drivers and the trucks and the cargo are the most visible element of the economy that moves through this zone, but they are not the only element. There are also people, human beings, moving through the same geographic corridor for their own reasons, their own purposes, their own desperation. The Central American Migration Corridor, the route by which hundreds of thousands of people from Guatemala and Honduras and El Salvador, and increasingly from other countries further south, attempt to reach the United States, runs through this same landscape. The trucks and the migrants share geography even when they do not share space, and the criminal organizations that operate in the border zone often have interests in both economies. Migrant smuggling in this corridor is its own complex industry with its own structures and its own violence. The coyotes, the people smugglers who guide and transport migrants northward toward the U.S. border, operate within the same broad ecosystem of organized crime that controls the drug transit economy and the extortion of commercial traffic. In some cases, they are the same organizations or the same individuals operating in different capacities. In other cases, they are competitors occupying different niches. The migrants themselves, often carrying everything they have in a backpack and sometimes having paid everything they have to a coyote for a journey that may take weeks or months, are among the most vulnerable people in the world when they pass through these transit zones. They cannot report what happens to them. They cannot seek help from authorities, who are frequently complicit in the systems that exploit them. They exist, in the zone between the checkpoints, and in the broader ungoverned spaces of the corridor, in a state of radical legal and physical exposure. The 8-kilometer stretch between El Florido and Agua Caliente is not primarily a migration corridor in the way that other routes through the Guatemala-Honduras border are. The presence of functioning border checkpoints, at both ends, means that people crossing without documentation tend to use other routes. The dozens of informal crossings, the trucas, that exist throughout the mountainous border region, where there are no checkpoints and no officials, and where the jungle or the cloud forest provides cover for movement that the official roads do not. But the dynamics of the official crossing, the way it concentrates commercial traffic and creates predictable, captive populations of drivers and vehicles and cargo, is itself a function of the same geography that makes the informal crossings necessary for some and dangerous for everyone. Let me tell you about a specific category of cargo that moves through this corridor, because it illuminates the economics in a way that abstract discussion of transit and extraction does not. Coffee. Some of the finest coffee in the world is grown in the highlands that surround this border zone, on both the Guatemalan and Honduran sides. The coffee of the Copan Department of Honduras, grown at altitude in volcanic soil, with cloud forest rainfall and the specific microclimates of the mountain valleys, is classified among the best in the world and commands premium prices in the specialty coffee markets of Europe, Japan, and North America. The coffee of Huetenango in Guatemala, grown in a department that borders Chiquimula to the west, is similarly prized. The supply chains that move this coffee from the farms where it is grown to the buyers who will pay a premium for it pass through this border region. A truck carrying green coffee beans, the unroasted product that will eventually become the cups of coffee consumed in cafes in Copenhagen and Tokyo and Brooklyn, is carrying something that has real value at the point of origin and dramatically more value at the point of destination. The people who control the transit zone know this. They know the rhythms of the coffee harvest. and the movement of the trucks and the likely value of what is inside. The premium that a cup of specialty coffee commands in a European city is many times what the farmer who grew the beans received for them, and somewhere in the distance between those two numbers, in the infrastructure of transport and processing and roasting and branding and retail markup, there is also the hidden cost of the transit zone, the percentage of the value that is extracted by the people who control the road. This is rarely visible in the final product. The person drinking a carefully prepared pour-over in a specialty cafe has no way of knowing, and no real mechanism for finding out, what happened to the trucks that carried the beans through the border zone between Guatemala and Honduras. The supply chain has a visible beginning, the picturesque farm on a volcanic slope with its shade trees and its careful pickers and the organic certification sticker, and a visible end, the barista, with the precise technique and the small card describing the elevation and processing method of the specific lot. Everything in between is infrastructure, and infrastructure, when it functions, is invisible. Even when the infrastructure is extracting value through organized criminal means, it tends to be invisible in the final product, because the cost is absorbed at the transport and processing stage rather than being passed on in a way that is legible to the consumer. The farmers know, the truckers know, the freight brokers know, the regional buyers who aggregate the coffee and prepare it for export know, and because they know, they have built the cost into their operating calculations. The price that a Honduran coffee farmer accepts for his harvest already incorporates, at some level, the reality of the transport corridor and the risks it imposes. The freight broker's margin incorporates the cost of the informal taxes and the potential losses. The cost of doing business in this region includes the cost of the corridor, distributed across the supply chain in ways that are invisible, but real, ultimately landing, as all costs ultimately do, on the people with the least power to resist them, which is the farmers and the drivers and the small operators, not the multinational buyers and the specialty roasters in distant consuming countries. Now I want to talk about something that rarely gets discussed in the context of this kind of story, which is what the people who live in this zone experience on an ordinary day, because the 8-kilometer stretch between the border posts is not an empty void. There are communities along and near it. There are people who have lived in this landscape their entire lives, whose families have been here for generations, who are not truckers or border officials or criminal actors, but simply residents of a border region that has become the site of extraordinary economic and criminal activity. The communities of the Chiquimula department in Guatemala and of the Copan department in Honduras are predominantly agricultural, subsistence farming of corn and beans, the foundational crops of Mesoamerican civilization that have been grown in this landscape for thousands of years, provides the food security foundation. Cash crops, coffee at altitude and sugarcane at lower elevations, and increasingly fruits and vegetables for export, provide the cash income that connects these communities to the broader economy. The people are largely poor by the metrics that economists use to measure poverty, but they are not without resources, without knowledge, without culture, without the specific richness of communities that have deep roots in a particular landscape. What they have that the outside observer often fails to see is an extraordinarily intimate knowledge of their environment, the kind of knowledge that develops over generations in a specific place and that constitutes a form of wealth that does not appear in GDP statistics but is absolutely real. The knowledge of which plants have medicinal properties and how to prepare them, the knowledge of the weather patterns of this particular valley and how to read the morning clouds and the evening wind to predict what the afternoon will bring, the knowledge of the soils and what they will grow and what they will not, the social knowledge of who can be trusted and who cannot, of which officials are operating within legitimate boundaries and which ones are not, of where the lines of power run in the local landscape and how to navigate around or between them. This knowledge is the survival technology of communities that have not always had the luxury of relying on state institutions to organize their safety. The children of these communities grow up with the border as a feature of their ordinary landscape. They know it the way you know any prominent feature of the place where you grew up, as part of the backdrop of the normal, not exotic or dramatic, but simply there. They know the trucks that pass through, They know the rhythm of the crossings. Some of them will eventually find work in the border economy in one way or another, as officials or as small traders, taking advantage of the differential in prices on either side, or as drivers, or as workers in the services that the traffic generates. And some of them will encounter the darker aspects of the economy that the border zone hosts, not because they sought it out, but because in a landscape where the visible and invisible economies are intertwined, where the official and unofficial uses of the same infrastructure overlap and intersect, it is very difficult to stay entirely clear of any of it. The border towns themselves, El Florido on the Guatemalan side and the settlement around Agua Caliente on the Honduran side, are the kind of places that border towns everywhere tend to be: transactional, layered, simultaneously important and overlooked. The money changers who work the margins of the official crossing, trading quetzales for lempiras and lempiras for dollars, operating in the gap between the official exchange rates and the reality of what travelers and truckers need in the moment. The food vendors, with their carts and their plastic tables, offering plates of rice and beans and grilled chicken, and the freshly made tortillas that are the ubiquitous currency of this cuisine. The mechanics who specialize in the particular problems that trucks develop after long hauls on mountain roads, the overheated brakes, and the transmission issues, and the tire blowouts that are the occupational hazards of moving heavy loads through terrain that is demanding of both machine and operator. These towns are alive. They are functioning communities, with schools and churches, and family structures, and social lives. They are also places where the visibility of the informal economy and the criminal economy is higher than in most other places, where the trucks that arrive stripped of their cargo or without their drivers are a reality that the community processes collectively, in the way that communities always process the things that happen around them, through rumor and story, and the particular kind of social knowledge that does not get written down anywhere, but that everyone in the place holds. The roadside businesses that have grown up along the route to service the truck traffic are their own economy. The commodores, the small restaurants that cater to drivers, are where the social knowledge of the road circulates most freely. Drivers compare notes. They share information about conditions on the route, about which crossings are moving quickly and which are backed up, about which officials are cooperative and which ones are making trouble, about what happened to a specific load that everybody knew was coming through on a specific day and did not arrive. The commodore is a clearinghouse for the operational intelligence of the corridor, and the women who run most of these establishments, because it is largely women who run them, absorb and hold an extraordinary amount of information about the movement of goods and people and the things that happen to both. There is a woman, I will not give her a name or a specific location, because that kind of precision creates risk for real people in this kind of environment. But there is a type of woman who runs a roadside commodore in a border zone who knows more about what actually happens in the 8 kilometers than any security analyst who has written a report about it from a capital city. She has been cooking for drivers for 20 years. She knows their names and their routes, and their employers and their families. She knows when a driver stops coming through, and she knows whether that is because he changed routes, or changed employers, or because something worse happened to him. She has heard the stories, not the sanitized versions that make it into official accounts, but the ones that drivers tell each other over plates of food when they are among people they trust, the real versions, with the real details about what the men on the road look like, and what they demand, and what happens if the demand is not met. She is not powerless in this landscape. She has her own forms of protection, the social relationships built over 2 decades of feeding people, the knowledge of who is who and what they want, the capacity to be useful to multiple parties without being captured by any of them. But she is also constrained in ways that are real, and that she navigates with the care and precision that such environments require. She does not call the police with what she knows, not because she does not know what she knows, but because calling the police in this context is not a straightforward act with a straightforward outcome. The relationship between the official institutions of law enforcement and the unofficial economies they are nominally supposed to suppress is complicated in ways that make simple whistleblowing a calculation with serious potential downside. This brings us to the question of law enforcement, which is essential to understanding the 8-kilometer gap, and which is also, in the Central American context, an extraordinarily complicated subject. Both Guatemala and Honduras have national police forces and, separately, specialized border and customs enforcement agencies. Both countries have military forces that are sometimes deployed in law enforcement roles, a practice with its own problematic history, given that the militaries of both countries were the primary instruments of political repression during the conflict periods of the 20th century. Both countries have prosecutors' offices and court systems and formally functioning legal institutions. Both countries have also, over the years, seen significant corruption within these institutions. The penetration of criminal organizations into law enforcement and judicial structures, the use of official positions to facilitate rather than suppress criminal activity, and the occasional reform moment when international pressure or domestic political crisis produces efforts to address the corruption, efforts that have had varying degrees of success and sustainability. The Guatemalan institution, known as CICIG, the International Commission Against Impunity in Guatemala, was one of the most ambitious and internationally recognized experiments in using external institutional support to strengthen prosecutorial capacity and address high-level corruption. Established in 2006, with a mandate from the United Nations and the Guatemalan government, CICIG operated for over a decade as an independent investigative body that worked alongside the Guatemalan Attorney General's office and produced a remarkable record of prosecutions of corrupt officials and criminal actors across multiple sectors of Guatemalan society. It investigated presidents. It investigated members of Congress. It investigated police generals and customs officials and businessmen who operated in the gray zone between legitimate commerce and criminal facilitation. And then it was shut down. In 2019, under President Jimmy Morales, Guatemala declined to renew CICIG's mandate and expelled its commissioners. The official reasons given were various, but the underlying reality was that an institution with the mandate and capacity to investigate powerful people had investigated powerful people, and those powerful people had found the means to end the investigation. CICIG had gotten close to the kinds of networks, the networks of official complicity in criminal economies, of exactly the kind that operate in the border zones, that powerful people in Guatemala did not want examined closely. The story of CICIG is the story of the 8-kilometer gap in institutional form. It is the story of what happens when the gap between formal institutions and the actual organization of power in a society is large enough that an institution designed to close the gap becomes a threat to the people who benefit from the gap existing. The trucks disappear in the 8 kilometers because the gap between the formal border posts is a space of limited effective jurisdiction. But the trucks disappear also, in a larger sense, because there are networks of interest that have an investment in things continuing to move in the way that they move, in the opaque rather than the transparent way, in the way that does not generate clear records and accountability chains, and the kind of paper trail that could, in theory, be followed by an institution with the mandate and the capacity to follow it. Honduras has had its own version of this story, its own cycles of institutional effort and institutional capture, its own moments of promise and regression. The administration of Juan Orlando Hernández, who served as president of Honduras from 2014 to 2022, was a case study in the way that executive power can be used to both publicly commit to fighting organized crime and privately facilitate it. Hernández presented himself internationally as a tough-on-crime leader whose cooperation with U.S. drug enforcement was an asset to American strategic interests in the region. He extradited drug traffickers to the United States and received DEA cooperation and counter-narcotics funding in return. He was also, according to the indictments that the United States eventually filed against him, accepting bribes from the very drug trafficking organizations he was publicly fighting, including a payment attributed to the Sinaloa cartel, and using state institutions to facilitate rather than suppress their operations. He was extradited to the United States after leaving office and convicted in 2024 on drug trafficking and weapons charges. His conviction is significant not only as an individual outcome, but as a demonstration of the structural reality that in Honduras, during his tenure, the person nominally responsible for combating the criminal networks that exploit the border zones was himself embedded within those networks. The trucks that disappeared in the 8 kilometers between Guatemala and Honduras did so in a context where the highest levels of the state were, at least in part, complicit in the system of extraction that made them disappear. Let me spend some time on the specific mechanics of how cargo theft and drug transit actually work in practice, because the abstract discussion of criminal organizations and corrupt officials can make it seem more abstract and less concrete than it actually is. The reality is specific and operational, and has a granular logic that is worth understanding. Cargo that is identified for theft in the border zone is usually not identified randomly. There is intelligence work that precedes the act. The criminal networks that operate in this corridor have informants and contacts at multiple points along the supply chain. A freight broker who passes cargo manifests information to criminal contacts. A customs official who flags particular loads as they come through. A warehouse worker at the origin point who notes what is being loaded onto which truck at what time. The information moves through networks that are invisible to the casual observer, but that function with remarkable efficiency, because they operate on the most basic of human motivations: the payment for information, the fear of consequences for not providing it. By the time a specific truck enters the 8-kilometer zone, the people waiting for it may already know what it is carrying, approximately what it is worth, when it is expected, and sometimes even which driver is behind the wheel. The interception, when it happens, is therefore not the chaotic, opportunistic robbery that the word robbery tends to conjure. It is often an